Greetings. So in our Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra series, which has been running for something like a year and a half now, we come to verse 97. And we are in the contemplative section of the text, meaning most of the practices in this section are contemplative practices, as opposed to more yogic practices. So in the classification that the tradition used later, about a century after this text, these contemplative practices are considered Shakta upaya, using thought and contemplation and the energy of the mind to redirect one's attention towards one's essence nature, defined in part as that aspect of oneself that is always present. Some simply call it the power of awareness itself, or awareness presence, or simply being. Anyway, the previous verse to this verse was a verse on observing the arising of a desire, and instead of just seeking to satisfy that desire, gently leading it back to where it arose from, and observing that desire and thought and impulse, all of this simply arises from consciousness itself spontaneously, and therefore you can follow it back into your natural state of presence or pure being. And now with this verse, we get a different variation. There's a few verses in a row here that talk about thought and desire. So I'll read or recite this verse in the Sanskrit and give you my translation. Yadā mamecchā notpannā jñānaṃ tadāsmi tattvato tathā bhūtas tallīnas tanmanā bhavet. Which means, when neither desire nor thought arise, who am I? Truly, I am just as I actually am. Having realized oneself in this way, one's mind becomes one with that essence nature and merges into that. So let's break this down a little bit. And I actually missed out a word, when neither my desire nor thought or cognition arise, who am I? So this is the contemplation. And the teaching here is not actually meant to imply that desire and thought are in some way extrinsic to the experience of being a human being, or extrinsic to your true personhood or anything like that. Rather, these are temporary phenomena. They're phenomena that arise and subside within consciousness or awareness. And so, insofar as we might want or not want to consider them to be essential traits or characteristics of a human being, we must acknowledge that they are ephemeral, that they are extremely temporary, impermanent. And so it doesn't really make sense to identify with them being desire and thought. And yet we do. That's the extraordinary thing, is humans do a lot of things that don't actually make sense. But what I mean to say by identification is that you think of yourself as the thinker of the thoughts, and you self-reference the thoughts. You praise yourself for good ideas or clever thoughts, and you condemn yourself and beat yourself up for so-called negative thoughts or desires. But this is absurd, because all these thoughts and desires arise spontaneously. Whether they arise, as they usually do, as a result of your conditioning, as a result of what your body mind has been conditioned to like or think, or whether they arise on some other basis, sort of fully spontaneously, doesn't really matter. They arise spontaneously either way. Do you see what I mean? Because we don't choose what to think before we think it. And if you think you can, just take another look, because if you decide what to think before you think it, you're already thinking it, and you didn't decide before that, right? The thought just came to you, or the idea to think about this just came to you, right? Which itself is a spontaneously arising thought. So even though most thoughts arise on the basis of causes and conditions, they still arise spontaneously. They arise out of nowhere. And desires too. None of us choose what or who to desire. And yet we self-reference desire so much. We give ourselves such a hard time for wanting what we don't think we should want, as if it was a choice. Nobody chooses what to feel or what to desire or what to think. Now, having said that, of course, you can chart a direction, to give yourself different kinds of experiences and different kinds of disciplines, if you will, that will make it more likely that different patterns of thought and behavior will arise in the future. Future is always now, but when it becomes now, that there could be different patterns of behavior or thought on the basis of this, a kind of gradual course correction, shifting the rudder of your boat, as it were. So over time, over quite a bit of time usually, you can change the sorts of thoughts you have. And well, this happens unconsciously, or it can happen with conscious intention. You can change the sorts of desires you have over time, over the course of some years. But in any given moment, you don't choose what to desire and what to think. And so it's absurd to give yourself all this, credit and blame, or indeed to self-reference on the basis of desire or thought at all. It just makes no sense. And also in the spiritual path, like I said, we realize I am not the thinker of the thoughts. I'm the one who is aware that thoughts are arising or not arising. But there is no thinker. There's no thinker of the thought. It just happens, right? So all this is true, and there's no contradiction with the fact that in the tantric tradition, in the Shaiva tantric tradition, not perhaps the Buddhist or others, but in the Shaiva tantric tradition, we hold that Icha Shakti, the movement of the will, we could call it, which sometimes manifests as desire, and Jnana Shakti, the power of cognition, are intrinsic to consciousness. Okay, that they are actually, part and parcel of consciousness, as opposed to some other doctrine or view, like the Sankhya view, which says, no, consciousness stands apart, totally apart from the body-mind. And actually, it doesn't have any powers or abilities or capacities, any shaktis. In the tantric tradition, we say, no, it has these innate shaktis, the power of, to experience joy, will, thought or cognition, and action. So this is not a contradiction, though, to what I was saying earlier. The fact that these powers are intrinsic to consciousness just means that all conscious beings have some version of these operations, movements of the will and movements of thought. Other mammals don't have discursive thought. They don't have verbal thoughts. But they have something like thought, just not not expressed in language. And very primitive, of course, but still something like that. Okay, so, but the fact that these Shaktis are intrinsic to consciousness does not in any way require us to, tell the story of agency, of separate self, that, I am the thinker of these thoughts. They just arise spontaneously, unconditioned or conditioned. Either way, they're spontaneous. Okay, so the instruction here, and I should note that this new Facebook software is not doing well so far. And if anyone's watching live, I'm not able to see you or your comments. Complain to Facebook for changing the software before it had been adequately debugged. But anyway, most people don't watch live, so it's not the end of the world. Something like 95% watch the recording, so I probably shouldn't go on about it. Anyway, here's the practice. That you notice these moments, and these moments happen every single day. You don't have to be, an enlightened being. You don't even have to be an advanced practitioner. These moments happen every single day for everyone, should they care to notice. It's just that most people don't care to notice. So what you're noticing is that there are these moments that are free of desire or thought, just moments of being. And for most people, they only last 1 or 2 seconds, maybe a few more. But this is the opportunity. This is a sort of, contemplation one can sit and do consciously, or you can take the opportunity many times throughout the day in what I call micro meditations to just notice, what is the nature of you, of your being, when it's temporarily free of desire and thought. Again, this is not to establish a separation between consciousness and its power of desiring or thinking. What it instead seeks to establish is that out of which, one might say, desires and thoughts are emerging. You could equally say within which they're emerging, but the point is that all energies of consciousness are emanations of consciousness in this view, which again is completely different and distinct from the Sankhya view or the Patanjalian view of classical yoga, which assert the opposite. So find out for yourself, But this tradition holds that desire and thought arise from what you are, but you need to see what you fundamentally are. You need to glimpse yourself in these moments free of or devoid of thought and desire. And then you kind of just inquire, well, what sort of thing am I? What is the nature of my consciousness? And this is not something you can answer in words, and don't even try, because it's useless. You just kind of repose in yourself and do this sort of investigation. It's an experiential investigation, not an intellectual one. And then you just have this simple moment of realization that can't be put into words. And when you try, the words are, sort of trite, like in the verse. Truly, I am just as I actually am. But those very simple, even trite words can represent a moment of beautiful revelation of your own being as pure being, as pure sort of isness, as pure presence. So the verse directs us to realize our true nature, little by little, more and more. For some people it comes in sort of a big revelatory flash, but for most people it's little by little, more and more, just kind of investigating what you are in this non-conceptual sense, right? It's not something the mind can make into an object of understanding. So when we try to do that, it just doesn't work. So then there's this further invitation in the verse that we allow the mind to sort of align itself with this essence nature, or even become one with it, or realize its own sort of non-separation from that. Because the mind isn't even actually an entity, it's a process, it's an activity. And this activity arises from what you more fundamentally are. So mental and emotional activity can arise and subside. And there's no actual mind that's just waiting there, to churn out thoughts. That's an imagination. There's just thought. There's just mental activity or lack thereof. Emotional activity is really the same thing, but less verbal and sort of more charged. So there's this invitation to notice that what you're calling mind is an activity arising from and subsiding into your deeper being. So yeah, that's the verse. And you can realize that, you can allow the mind to simply dissolve into your natural presence when it's not actually needed. And this takes a little practice, The mind just dissolves into natural presence. It doesn't need to stay there when it's not needed. And this is what the verse is inviting. Tallīnas, tanmanā bhavet. So I invite you to play with that a little bit. I'd like to thank all the patrons on Patreon whose generous support every month has made it possible for a couple years now, and continues to make it possible to produce free content for all of you. And this entire course of the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, which is taking 2 years to get through this text in detail, was only possible because of the patrons. So thank you. Om.